Hi everybody and welcome to this NQA webinar, ISO 27001 Back to Basics. My name's John Millichap and I work in the commercial team at NQA. NQA are a UK-based UCAS accredited certification body and we're part of Element Group, who are a global leader in testing, inspection and certification. NQA specialises in management system certification and associated training, and my role is to engage with existing and new customers and to provide advice, guidance and costing in relation to a customer's requirements. Those requirements could be looking at a new standard or working with a customer who is exploring transferring their current management systems to a new certification body. In a nutshell, NQA are here to support you on your certification journey and drive continual improvement. ISO 27001 is one of the many standards within our extensive portfolio. It has been the fastest growing standard in the UK for the past 2 years. NQA has responded to this by investing in our assessor resource and introducing a specialised InfoSec hub to support our customers with the risks they face in today's business environment. I will be around for the Q&A at the end of this webinar if you have any questions about certification in general or about NQA services. But now on with the main event. I'm delighted to welcome Barri-Jon Graham from Risk Evolves, who will be your presenter today. Over to you, Barry.
John, thank you very much. And very much welcome to everybody who's chosen to attend, and to those catching up later in the day or perhaps next week. Welcome also, and thank you for subscribing to this. As the headline might suggest, this is a training package which is designed to give a foundational understanding of information security management system, what it entails, and some tips about staying safe while operating in a cyber environment. And certainly those with a management system already, we're going to examine some of the pitfalls which are commonly encountered. A bit of a background about me. So I have extensive experience in security, threat intelligence, including working with people, assets and infrastructure. Worked in a wide variety of roles, including public and private sector, and came to NQA's attention a number of years ago when I was a full-time assessor auditing for 27001, and certainly looking at the attendees who have made it to the webinar in its live sense. I recognise a few names there, so if you've met me before as your auditor, then thank you very much. And welcome again. So why do I feel suitable to be able to deliver a back to basics course? Well, actually, nobody's perfect, but the wisest people, as Socrates says, know only one thing, and that they know nothing other than they need to develop and learn. So despite all of the accolades on screen here, my approach to every day is one of open-minded learning and the potential to improve, which I think is underpinned by NQA's own stance of never stop improving. So not every slide or conversation we have over the next half hour or so will be revealing for you all. Rather, it may be in some respects familiar if you are a risk or a security or an IT professional, for example. However, one thing I think I'm really hopeful for is that collectively the whole picture will make sense and give you good food for thought moving forward. It's certainly worked for me when I've been implementing, auditing and managing information security management systems. And I look forward to hearing from you either during or certainly after, when there's time for questions. So if you've got something you want to ask me, by all means, pop it in the questions panel there, and I'll be more than happy to address that question at a suitable point, or if not, at the end. The less to say about the picture, the better. I simply don't have a good side for camera. Oh well. So by the end of this course, hopefully you will understand the things you can see on the screen there, the fundamentals, the building blocks of a management system, some of the common pitfalls both in implementing and maintaining, why 27001 can help your organization, and give you an idea or a flavor of some of the changes you may have read about which are on the horizon. Around about 44,000 organizations are ISO 27001 certified, and that number continues to grow year on year. It is very clear that organizations are coming to understand it's important in the current environment, but it can be difficult to make sense of it if you aren't familiar with the concept of a management system or the concept of information security. And therefore, we'll provide an overview of what this is and why it's important, and tips on the best practices to help you achieve certification or maintain certification. So data is one of the most valuable resources of the world in which we live in the 21st century. But its supreme status in modern society also makes it an incredibly sensitive and a highly regulated area. Almost every organization deals with some kind of customer or employee data, for example, and others are even built in on developing or managing information assets. And organizations further still provide the infrastructure we now all use, which we know as the cloud. Cybercrime, data theft, and viral attacks are all very real scenarios that could put your data and your organization's reputation at risk. A recent report I read, which came from IPN and the Ponemon Institute, estimates that the average cost of a data breach in 2021 freaking sees around the $3.7 million mark. So that's a lot of money if there's a data breach, especially if it's a large-scale breach. But it also affects small businesses too. And the National Cybersecurity Centre released data recently which indicated 40% of all of UK businesses have reported cybercrime, and that's the ones that indeed reported their breach. Protecting data was once the sole responsibility of an IT department, but given the volume of data we all use today and the ever-changing threat landscape, information security is now assumed to be every single person's responsibility within an organization. Across all businesses, internal and external information security experts are spending increasing amounts of time and resources protecting data held on company networks and systems. The same due diligence should be extended to information shared with third parties and suppliers and vendors, for example, or where data processing activity occurs off-site or in somebody else's domain. This could be printers, cloud-based software hosting, for example, we're using one right now, or external supply chain partners. One way to monitor and mitigate security risks is to make sure third parties meet or exceed the standards you expect, and you work with those organizations to ensure that they're encouraged to achieve the same level of compliance to certification schemes like ISO 27001. So the commentary on the left-hand side is designed to be a memory jog. So the structure of the slides you'll see, the main points I want to make are in the white area and then the blue area, a sort of a memory jog. So when you're reviewing these slide decks or listening to the webinar further into the future from when we're first delivering this, it acts as a memory thing. So please bear that in mind. Don't worry if you don't get to read everything before we move on. As I say, you'll get a copy of this and if you've subscribed. So what is it? So what is 27001? ISO 27001 is the international standard that describes best practices for an information security management system. It's based on a set of controls and measures which organizations may use to achieve information security or an understanding of the risks to their security. More specifically, it outlines the stipulations for implementing a thorough management system. Organizations that are ISO 27001 certified have been audited by independent information security experts, and those experts are scrutinized in turn to make sure they're suitable in terms of the kind of person they are before they're allowed to audit you. So it's fair to say that if you've achieved certification, you've been through the ringer a little bit. The organization is then regularly audited beyond the point at which they're certified by independent and accredited certification body individuals to ensure that it complies with the standards of the ISO 27001 scheme. What it isn't is a magic shield which stops your information being accessed by other parties. It's not an insurance or it's not a cast iron guarantee that you won't be subject to a breach, for example. However, when it's utilized correctly, it's a real business enabler and an assurance tool to ensure that top management are aware of all of the risks to your information. The ISO 27001 standard is an effective way to keep your company's information secure when you take the right steps to implement it. It provides a structured approach to implementing, integrating, and continuously improving the way you do things, including your management system. It helps you to protect assets from both internal and external threats by making sure that you understand your organization's needs, requirements, and risk appetite. Apply policies, procedures, and controls to manage these risks within the defined parameters of the organization's tolerance levels. So you set a level at which you're happy that risks exist, and anything above that level, quite simply, you must do something about it. It also allows you to monitor performance against these standards on an ongoing basis. But the key question, I guess, is, what does that mean? So what are the requirements for 27001? It sounds great, doesn't it? You know, we're going to set up this risk framework and understand where our problems live in an information sense, but what do we actually have to do? So if you open the pages of the standard, the first thing you'll encounter is clauses 0 to 3, and that's just guidance for the core concepts which follow. Clauses 4 to 10, sorry, clauses 0 to 3 are introduction, scope, and normative references, terms and definitions. They cover the basics of 27001 and provide you the context that you need to begin to understand the core concepts. So, and get the terminology right. So we all come from different backgrounds and have a different idea about what risk assessment might mean. For example, what is an asset? So if you read clauses 0 to 3, you'll begin to understand the way the standard is structured in a sense. Where you actually have to start doing some work is at clauses 4 to 10. Clauses 4 to 10 contain all of the information you might need in order to put this into place. If you're familiar with other ISO standards, such as ISO 9001 for quality, or ISO 22301 business continuity, you'll see that clauses 4 to 10 overlap directly in terms of clause 4 being where you establish the scope of the management system, so the scope of the information management system. Now, for bigger organizations, this doesn't have to be everything. This just has to be an area you want covered by the certificate, so an area where your information security is most at risk. So let's just take a classic factory, for example. Not everything that happens in that factory is required to be covered by a certificate, for example. Perhaps it's just the corporate IT network or the corporate IT structure or the finance department or so on and so forth. So not everything that happens in an organization needs to be covered. But clause 4 forces you to address looking at that issue and determining what you want covered by your management system. It also makes you look in the environment you operate in and some of the binding factors. So for example, if you work in the financial services industry, you have pieces of regulation and legislation and scrutinization from bigger institutions than you might have if you were, for example, working in a different sector in the economy. So clause 4 makes you look at that, those environmental things. It also makes you look inside the business to see what sort of factors and challenges you're facing. And you're forced to document these at clause 4 and really get to know who you are in the business, the circles you move in, who your interested parties are, and what the pressures upon you. Clause 5 is concerned with leadership because no management system can be successfully implemented unless top management are bought into the process. Now, top management must set the pace, must set the scene and provide the resources necessary to make it effective. And there's some very specific requirements in terms of documenting policies, establishing who does what inside the management system, and making sure the resources are there to make it a success. So clauses 4 and 5 just set the scene for what is really truly the bread and butter of ISS, an ISMS or ISO 27001, and that's the planning clause. Within the planning clause of all of the standards, there is a requirement to identify the risks. The first step, and we're going to come on to pitfalls, but I'll say it here again, the first step in completing any risk assessment is establishing what it is you're trying to protect. What are the information assets which are in play? And it's a whole lot more than hardware. For most people who come on the course to deliver with lead auditor or the implementer course, if I ask them to list what information assets is, more often than not, they'll write laptop. A few of the more savvy amongst the cohort will write a few more things, but ultimately it all points at hardware. As we've just said, information itself is an asset. So the things we process that information on, such as a laptop, a tablet, or increasingly a mobile phone, are equally important in terms of the things we need to protect. People, expertise, reputation, so on and so forth. The list isn't exhaustive here, but it's important before we make a risk assessment to understand what we're trying to protect. And then once we know what we're trying to protect, we move on to actually completing a risk assessment. Now, clause 6 in ISO 27001 takes this a step further and says, once you've identified the assets and then the risks you wish to protect, the risk to those assets, it gives you a list of solutions at Annex A. So Annex A, as it says on the slide there, are where the risk controls can be found. Annex A is not the entirety of the standard. People who approach this standard, ISO 27001, who are not familiar assume it's just IT stuff and technical things. Yes, there is a degree of that at Annex A, but all that is a list of risk controls, nothing else. It's not a guideline to how to run a business. It's not a guideline to how to run your IT team. They are just risk controls. Clause 6 forces you to address what are the risks. It also guides you to create a document in order where you specify how you're going to control those risks. It sounds complex, but actually it's quite easy. For most of us who have ever operated a risk register, we know how that works. We just write in what we think the controls to the risks are within the risk register. The only difference in 27001 is that we point at the list of things it's provided for us in order to demonstrate how we're controlling risks. And that's the key difference between some of this standard and some of the others you might have encountered. Clause 7, once we've done the risk assessment process and we've identified how we're going to control those risks, Clause 7 gives us an idea of the competence of the people carrying out these actions, and that includes all staff. What is the baseline of understanding for all personnel in an organization? And then there are going to be some enhanced roles and responsibilities. So what training do those people need to make sure that this is going to work correctly? And then we've also got things such as communication, staff awareness, external awareness, so on and so forth. Clause 7 concerns supporting the things we're going to do. Clause 8 in 27001 concerns carrying out what you said you're going to do. So at Clause 6, you've said, here is my asset, here is the risks of that asset, and here is the control we think we need to control the risk. At Clause 8, it just ensures that you carry out the actions you intended to carry out. So it's a little bit different to some of the other standards you may be familiar with, certainly those with other ISO experience. Clause 8 is where a lot of the work happens. So for example, in 9001, the bulk of the standard, that's where it happens. Clause 8 in 27001 is simply carrying out the actions you've identified you were going to carry out at Clause 6. Clauses 9 and 10 are common across all Annex SL documentations. ISO 27001 is no different. There is a need to review the actions you've taken via internal audit, monitor and measure the performance of the management system by identifying performance indicators, for example, and making any adjustments based on your findings, using Clause 10, the improvement log, which provides feedback on how you've carried out your risk assessment, risk treatment, and risk control as a whole. Now that's a very much whistle-stop tour of the whole thing. What I haven't listed here is all of the controls at Annex A or all of the clauses in detail. It's assumed that you've either read or intend to read a copy of the ISO documentation to see exactly how that is mapped out. What I'm trying to get to here is how the standard is structured and how to implement it effectively. The key difference between other ISOs you may have encountered and 27001 is the Annex A, which is referenced at Clause 6 within the planning, risk assessment process and risk treatment process. It gives you the solution to the risks you've identified quite simply. And we'll move on to what that means next. So what do I do then? So now we know why we need to ISO 27001. It provides a framework of risk and understanding to prevent us being hopefully the subject of a data breach or a cyber attack. We now know how the standard is structured. It's a clause domain familiar to us, Annex SL model and Annex A providing the risk controls. So what do we do to get things going? Okay. So before you speak with a certification body and a reputable one such as NQA, you need to undertake a number of things in-house and self-reflect. Ordinarily, that might be a gap analysis like it says on the left of the screen there, and that's where you stop. You have a look at the processes which are in action already, whilst looking at the standard which you've opened and then determining what don't you do that you now need to implement. So for example, do you have a repeatable risk assessment process? If not, then you need to put one in. Do we have a documented list of interested parties? If not, then that's what you need to do. If you're not sure where to start though, a couple of basic things which this webinar will do. Define your ISMS scope. So one of the most important steps in becoming certified is definition of the scope of your management system. Your scope should cover your organization's systems, processes, locations, services, applications, department, personnel, and data, etc. And those are the components which make up your ISMS. It doesn't, like I said before, have to cover all of the organization. It can be partial in terms of where you implement it and test and adjust and make it work and make it improve, and then you can expand outwards. But it does need to cover something, and so getting the scope of your certification is an important first step, because all of the work which follows will be born out of that foundation. Next thing to do is hopefully perform a risk assessment. To ensure that your management system addresses threats appropriately and then conforms with the standard, you'll need to perform a risk assessment. A risk assessment will help you identify the necessary controls to mitigate applicable risk. For risks that require mitigation strategies, for example, you'll need to create a risk treatment plan. So a typical example I would use on a lead auditor course when I'm delivering that is that if you want to screen your personnel to ensure they are who they say they are before they get to the business, then you'll need to carry out a risk assessment of what threat do personnel pose and identify the risks in accordance with that. Then you will lay out, okay, what are we going to do about making sure we are getting the people we need and they're the right kind of person and the right caliber, and not going to deliberately do things which lead to reputational damage. You need to set out a plan, and that's called a risk treatment plan. You now need to complete your statement of applicability. So as mentioned above, your statement of applicability should state which Annex A controls were determined to be necessary for inclusion. So we go back to the planning on the previous slide. It says there's 114 things or 93 things which you can do about the risks you've identified. Your statement of applicability is simply those things listed and then indicated about whether you need those risk controls or not. So to go back to our HR example, there is a control in Annex A which says we're going to screen and train and provide a contract for our employees. So now we do need those things, so you simply select those 3 controls because they are needed. So your statement of applicability document sits alongside your risk assessment and risk treatment plan because it tells you what you're going to do about the risks you've identified. Once you've done that, and hopefully you're familiar with that, then you need to document information security policies. The policies you implement will become the foundation of your management system and security strategy. These should be defined, approved by top management, published and communicated with the broader organization. The policy itself should be relevant to the organization you work with, clarify your information security objectives, show a commitment to satisfy the standards requirements, and include Annex A controls and ensure continuous improvement. Ordinarily, the policies will be signed off at the very least by top management, but ideally top management will integrate into this process and have their say in what the policy set should look like. Once you've reached that point, you've established scope, completed a risk assessment, risk treatment plan, and established your risk controls, set out the policies, then you need to operationalize your ISMS. And that's putting these things into play, making it work. And this is where clauses 9 and 10 come into play, because once you've done that, you need to review the effectiveness of how you've implemented that system. And you can do this by auditing, by measuring against the needs of the standard, whether the things you've done are effective. If they're not effective, and they won't be the first time you do it, then you need to identify improvements. And then from there, once you've identified those improvements, implement a corrective action plan. And that's the cycle. Once you've reached the corrective action plan, you've identified, for example, a number of things which are difficult. Risk controls were ineffective. The policies were not consistent with broader operational goals, for example. You then need to revisit the areas where they need improving and take action as necessary. The standard itself gives you a good list, a good guide on how you can do this, including how to own it, how to set dates for making the improvements effective, and how to review those things. You're going to need to demonstrate that you've done this before you achieve certification anyway. So actually, it's really good practice to put this into play as early as you can. It is required for senior level management to continuously review the management system and ensure that it's a hands-on approach and not just left to the sort of compliance manager, IT team, wherever the responsibilities sit. So management must get involved. When internal or external changes come along which impact the management system, such as political change, and I think those of us tuning in from the UK are familiar with that at the moment, or any other feedback from external bodies, for example, any updates or improvements to the management system, those must be filtered through top management, so all changes are subject to approval. Once you've done this, you've gone through the first steps of implementing. At that point, it's usually a good time to organize with NQA or any other certification body you choose about when you want to go through your certification audits. That's a two-stage process, whereby stage one, an auditor will turn up, establish the documentation required for your management system, see how well it's been rolled out, and then stage two, where they test the evidence. So have those risk controls been effective? Have you got a good level of risk understanding? So on and so forth. So only once you've done a lot of things in-house can you then reach out to certification body and carry out your certification audit. Here's where we can add value then. The pitfalls with management systems are fairly inconsistent depending upon the standard. In 27001, I asked some of my auditor colleagues to put together a list of common non-conformities or common things which go wrong with management systems which have been implemented or management systems which are aspirational. And here's what we've come up with. So first off, defining the right scope for the implementation of the management system can be really tricky when you get it to its needed level. On one hand, some large and complex organizations could completely overestimate the planning to adopt a too ambitious approach, including a lot of non-required tasks and activities which drain resources. As a result, the risk to squander resources, not reaching the target, and demotivating the team involved will likely be realized. On the other hand, organizations squeezing their scope too much, for example, by excluding as many controls as they can see fit from the statement of applicability, or neglecting some of their interfaces, will likely encounter non-conformities during their certification audit, as they were not able to demonstrate that they're fully in control of their information security or the management system in general. The recommended approach for a realistic ISMS implementation plan across an organization is to execute pragmatic risk assessments blended with the implementation of the missing best practices. The result there is a well-adopted statement of applicability and good planning. The auditors will then be confident within their ISMS implementation and achieve certification for the organization. So getting the scope right, don't be too ambitious, don't be too modest, go through the process a number of times until you're comfortable with where the scope area needs to be. Another common pitfall is lack of poor roles and responsibilities definition. This isn't a compliance manager's job or an IT manager's job. This is top management job, okay? A typical pitfall is to consider an ISO 27001 implementation project as an IT project, and the hands-off from other top management is evident. What happens in these situations is that people who ordinarily would have responsibilities are not sure where they start and where they end, and it really does fall down as a result. An ISMS is in fact a transversal project impacting holistically every facet of an organization and all of its departments, including executives, all personnel, as well as partners and stakeholders. So it's important that all people are involved and a clear set of definitions about who does what within a management system is laid out, and that those people with responsibilities are aware of their responsibility set. That leads on to the next pitfall, and one of the most, not common, but one of the most damning findings when you're conducting an audit is the lack of buy-in from executive level. In certain organizations, the executive level does not see what the added values of an information system for their businesses are. Some organizations, and these can be local as well as international, perceive their cyber footprint as an insignificant thing and still cannot imagine that they can possibly be the target for a cyber criminal, such as disclosure of confidential or privacy data, a malware attack, cyber blackmail, or crypto mining, for example. It's only after the fact that executives take note and start to release resources to the security team. In this case, the executive level don't consider implementation projects as real added value for their organization, customers, or employees. They simply want a certificate so they can enter into a tender process. So a few years ago, during the first major wave of ransomware attacks, for example, many organizations stopped their activities once they were crypto locked for the following reasons. There was no security policies in place and no backup, no awareness campaign, no recovery plan, personnel weren't aware what to do, etc. That seemed to have stemmed in some respects, so people are getting savvy now that actually there is a real danger and a real threat out there. And one of the things that the new standard is to force you to address the threat picture and look at what you're doing to make sure you're not victim. However, it still does happen, and there's a disconnect between executive level and the people trying to implement a security system. Another one, yeah, ISMS, it's not for us. We spend widely in technical security measures. We have X, Y, or Z certification schemes which ensure that we are safe. Okay, so information security can be considered as a strong chain in the overall security posture of an organization. But that chain is only as strong as the weakest link. Administrative measures, such as policies, awareness, controls, sanctions, processes, etc., and then implementing those with technical measures, environmental measures, and physical measures. So the whole picture needs to be complete. ISO 27001 allows you to do that. Focusing solely on the technical or cybersecurity measures will not ensure security. Okay, awareness of employees is equally as important, and physical access to information are also important. Down at the bottom there, people also assume I've got an IT service provider, I've got a consultant, and that is the solution. That's not the case. Consultants are a definite capability enhancer, as it says, but it's not the only way forward to ensure compliance and success of a management system. It needs to be part of the fabric of the organization. Consultants can come in and certainly can assist and can prop up an ailing system and make sure it's going to succeed in the future, but they can't be the entire solution. Experience has told me, and other auditors in the same field as well, that where a management system, policies, procedures and practices sit on a laptop which doesn't even exist inside the scope area, we've got a few issues. Okay, so having consultants and third parties manage these things for you is not the answer. I think the final one, which we'll touch upon in another webinar in the future, is third parties, especially cloud service providers, IT main service providers. They are part of the solution, absolutely, but they do not then mean that the company in question is completely hands-off. Okay, you need to own or joint ownership, especially with IT main service providers. You need joint ownership of the problem, of the security solution, of the effectiveness of the management system. Certainly, it's not an insurance policy which will ensure that you're never breached or subject to an attack. It's just less likely if you work together. So before we move and into questions, some people are certainly ahead of the webinar who are now on asked about changes which are coming. So yeah, as it suggests on screen there, in October of this year, the new version of the standard was released, 2022 version, of which training has now commenced, and NQA are offering that. And it changed the number of controls. So earlier in the slide deck, I said there were 114 controls in Annex A. So 114 things you can do about risk, which were listed in Annex A of the standard. That has been reduced down now to 93, and that's been done through consolidating where controls overlapped. Importantly, there are no removed controls. There have been controls added along with consolidated. So there are now 93 instead of 114. Where those controls sit has also been simplified as well. So in the past, we've used 14 control groups such as organization, human resource security, asset management, access control, physical security, so on and so forth. They've been simplified now into organizational controls, people controls, physical controls, and then technology controls. So going back to the pitfalls of saying, yeah, we've got technology controls in place, we're safe. That's just one part of the picture. The organization, the people who work within it, and any physical controls for buildings in which infrastructure or information is held, all equally important to make sure that the whole picture is secure. And this has brought us up to speed. So some of the new controls include things like how to engage with, utilize, maintain, and then exit from cloud services. How to do the same but for your IT service providers. How to understand the threats, analyze the threats, and produce actionable response to the threats which an organization may face. So really interesting. So if you've enjoyed the webinar and want to learn more, then please do tune into any of the NQA provided or Risky Balls provided guides to the new ISO 27001 standard. So that's how you can find me at Risk Evolves. John, I'm sure you're still on the call, so if you want to provide any details about NQA and how to reach you guys in order to achieve certification, do you want to say anything about that now?
Yeah, I think just obviously just Google NQA certification. The website's there, and we've got a live chat, and we've got other contact mediums if you want to get in touch with us. And obviously, we're happy to speak to any organisations that are either looking at ISO 27001 as a new standard, or there may be some organisations on here with other certification bodies who are considering transferring, and we're happy to have a discussion with them and obviously give them some advice, guidance and costing.
Excellent, thanks, John. In terms of this presentation, like it suggests, it was just a back to basics look. Really happy to connect with you individually or as an organization on LinkedIn. My details are on there. You can reach me direct. Those are my email address there. What we'll do now is, for those who have other things to do and other places to be, just thank you very much for tuning in to this Back to Basics webinar. Keep an eye out on other things we're going to be doing in future, such as the management of third parties and how to address some of the new risk controls we've just discussed. And I hope to see you either at one of those or a training event with NQA soon. Anyone who wishes to stay and ask a few questions, we'll do that now. I'll begin with the questions which have been posted into the questions bar during the presentation and then work our way through. So thanks for your time and goodbye if you're leaving us now. So David asked the question, we're in the process of implementing 27. The organization is a third-party risk consultancy. Are there any hints or tips for implementation, especially for companies who are primarily bring your own device and conduct our work on customer networks? Yeah, as you can imagine, yeah, drawing that imaginary box about what is covered and what is not is not a simplistic thing. So David, yeah, I know you're probably going to catch up on this later on, but bring your own device policy is absolutely needed, and then specifying things you can and can't do with that device and how you inventory that device and control the security features within that device are needed to be included in that policy. So you must make sure you get that right if you're acting in the consultant capacity, and then likewise when you go to whichever customer site it is, make sure you hoover up their policies, practices and procedures and communicate clearly that this is a personal device, albeit covered by a certification scheme, but point out that it is a personal device, although you've done as much in terms of security as you can. I hope that helps. So Hanamantha, what is the difference between SOA controls and risk controls? So they are the same thing. So the risk controls included in Annex A of the ISO 27001 standard are the risk controls. In every other standard, you are still required to identify risks and opportunities, for example, but then you're not told how to control those risks. In 27001, once you've finished establishing what the risks are through your risk assessment process, then you create a statement of applicability, which is a list of all of the controls which are provided for you, and then you select which of those risk controls you're going to use to control the risks you've identified. The same is true of the 27001, which has just been released. It's just that the terminology around the risk controls and the overall number of risk controls have changed. So Kathy asks, we have a 27 certificate and are due to be audited in December. We haven't updated policies and procedures in line with the latest edition. Do we need to get that in place? No. So Kathy, if you've arranged to have your certification audit before the new standard came out, which I'm going to assume you have given the timelines, then you're still viable to be audited against the 2013 version. There is no specific to organization guideline yet on when you will have to make the transfer to the new standard. However, there is a hard deadline of the 1st of November 2025. So all organizations will have to be over to the new certificate by then. I'm going to assume, based on the proximity of your audit, that is going to be the case for you. You're going to have, simply put, just a little short of 3 years to fix and get over to the new standard. And yeah, Abdul Karim, yeah, thank you. I think you're asking for the differences in terms of the two standards, there's been a couple of adjustments. Like I said, on the last slide we did before we went into questions, there was an outline of the risk controls which have changed, but there is also a few changes in the main body. So for example, if you've got a copy of the new standard now, the terminology around the statement of applicability has changed to indicate that you can control risk using outside sources, so not given inside the Annex A. It also has a change management process specified within the planning. So 6.3, which has never been there before, now specifies that change management must be a planned activity. So tool for monitor implementation, that's entirely up to you. I use a project tracker and Gantt chart, for example. You may be familiar with those. I use that, so I write in exactly what I want to achieve, the order in which I want to achieve it, and the resources I need to make that happen. And I just use it in the same way I would develop any kind of project. Okay. I can't see any more questions. So my details are on screen. So if you have any more questions, you can think about a point further down the line, and please do feel free to ask, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. I will hang on the line for another 60 seconds, and if there are any questions, I'll answer it then. If not, thank you for attending again, and I'll see you in the future. Okay, all. Thank you very much for your time. It's been a pleasure. Have a great weekend wherever you are, and speak to you soon.